The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Out from the Shadows.
Oops. Welcome. I wasn't live in the studio because I'm in a very somber and reflective mood, having just had a little conversation with our guest who's waiting in the wings to come on the show tonight. Allow me to start tonight's show by letting those in the audience who don't know and reminding those who do that I was on the City of David archaeological expedition in 1981. This was while I was getting my theology degree. And the particular theology degree that I got from Ambassador College, later Ambassador University, focused on the Bible, its texts. It wasn't so much studying into, the church fathers and theology, classically speaking. It was a deep dive into the Bible, the texts, their context. We did a lot of study about ancient Israel, so that we could understand the Old Testament in the context in which it was written, and the same with the New Testament. But the group I was in and later became a minister in was kind of like Messianic Judaism in reverse. We were Christians, but we went back to the law of Moses. We went back to what Jesus was, which was a Jew, and what Jesus did, which was keep Jewish practice. And he advised his disciples not to celebrate his resurrection, but to celebrate his death through the Passover. He introduced new symbols, but he told them to do this in remembrance of me and to keep the Passover. So we did. He didn't tell people to celebrate his birthday, so we didn't. And so on and so forth. But we went deep back into the laws of Moses. We kept some of the food laws, the Jewish holy days. We were like Messianic Jews in reverse. And so when the opportunity came up for me in conjunction with Hebrew University to attend and participate in the City of David archaeological expedition, I jumped at it. All of this, dear friends, is being brought back to me because in the studio we have the son of Holocaust survivors. And we have an amazing discussion planned for you, talking about his books. His name is Willie Handler. He's had a long life. And one of the books he wrote is Coming Out of the Shadows, as he learned over time about the Holocaust from people who had experienced it but didn't want to talk about it. Well, we're going to talk about it tonight. Welcome to the studio, Willie.
Thank you. Sort of nice to be here.
Well, and it's wonderful to have you, and it's a real honor. And as we always do on this show, we want to get to know the real you. And it's just so fitting for this show because we always talk about your creation story. What were the circumstances into which you were brought forth? Who were your parents? And of course, that's part of the whole show anyway. So let's talk about young lad Willie and how he was growing up, where he grew up, what he was like before he became aware of the things that you know today.
It took me a long time to become aware, actually. So as you mentioned, my parents were both Holocaust survivors. My father was Polish. He survived 7 different camps, and he lost he was married with kids, and he lost his family. My mother was Romanian, and the Holocaust of Romania was quite different than the rest of Europe because the Romanian government was aligned with Nazi Germany, and she was deported with all the Jews in her province several 100,000 to a barren region in Ukraine called Transnistria, and probably close to half the people perished there in the 2 years they were there. They met in Israel and eventually immigrated to Canada and settled in the city of Toronto, where I was born. So my childhood was, I thought my childhood was like any other sort of immigrant family. But as I started to grow older and become more aware, I realized that no, that's not really the case. My parents were very, they were loving and almost smothering, but they were not capable of providing the type of support that children needs. I was very much on my own. I was talking about this with a therapist recently, how much I was on my own. Um, and so
And I apologize because I was just reflecting on a number of things and I missed it. Their path to immigration. Did you say it went through Israel?
they both, following the war in different years, they immigrated to. My mother got in illegally while it was still under the British mandate. My father came after the Israel gained independence. They met and they got married there. In fact, my older sister was born in Israel, and the three of them immigrated in '53 to Canada. Um, so that's
So
sort of the history.
it's about the time, maybe a couple of years later, that my dad landed in Canada from Sweden. But
Ah,
he traveled west. He didn't stop in Toronto. He headed out to BC. But anyway, so
ah.
you had an older sister. Did you have other siblings at all?
I have a younger brother as well, and he was also born in Toronto, as I was.
Mhm.
My mother, in fact, arrived in Canada pregnant. So when she showed up at the hospital, she still couldn't speak English.
With you or your older
Uh,
sister?
No, with me, with me.
With you.
She,
Yeah.
it's sort of a humorous story where she showed up. It was a Sunday, and she showed up, and she couldn't explain why she was there, and they kept trying to tell her that the clinics are all closed on Sundays. Come back tomorrow. And finally, they found a Yiddish-speaking doctor who figured out that she was in labor.
Wow.
And well, so that's the life
So
of
you were
that's
causing problems. You were causing problems, right, even
yeah.
before you came
And I was an incubator baby on top of that,
out.
so I was like a little undersized. Now I've sort of filled out and made up for it. But anyway, as I was kind of alluding to, I grew up very much had to do everything on my own. I became independent far too young. I brought home homework. There's no one who's going to help me. Problems of school, I had to deal with it. Picking courses. That was what I was talking about my therapist earlier. Um, she asked how I picked my initial career. And I, and everything was like this. And if you wanted to play sports, well, there was no one's going to take me. I had to drag my own ass to hockey rink or whatever. So the best way to describe it,
Were your parents somewhat insular? They didn't have a lot of social contacts, or what was going on there?
they just worked. They just worked. And so for my parents, the priorities were um, shelter, housing, food, clothing, and my mother did a lot of her own sewing, so that's that's another that's another issue. Um, but and that was sort of it. And then I started noticing, and we did nothing as a family, absolutely nothing. No family vacations, and it was and I noticed people had grandparents or these older people that hung around them. And I had none. And so as time went on, you start noticing they had heavy accents. That you were so much different than everyone else, um, uh, and on top of it, they were both traumatized. So um, they had very different kind of idiosyncrasies and habits and stuff that get passed on. I had no, people did not understand what intergenerational trauma was, and um, I really didn't have a good grasp of what it was for the longest time. I denied I ever had any, even when I knew about it.
Well, and in terms of intergenerational trauma, I want to go really deep on that topic for a moment, because you're Jewish, and even those who don't have a Jewish identity can read about the Jewish identity through the pages of the Bible, and it goes back thousands of years. And there's this thing called, I will make you a peculiar people, right? And then there are prophecies about being set apart from the other nations. And then there's the lost 10 tribes who lost their identity, right? The first time the word Jews is mentioned in the Bible, they are actually at war with Israel, because there was a northern and a southern kingdom, the
Right.
kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And Israel was at war with Judah, the Jews, and Israel lost their identity because they assimilated. They became completely assimilated. So Hitler didn't know to pin a yellow star on them, because they didn't even know who they were historically. But the Jews kept that identity. They were able to be identified, and then they went through the Holocaust. But this issue of Jewish identity and to assimilate or not to assimilate, it's Macbethian, right? To be or not to be, to assimilate or not to assimilate. So you've got these identity issues. So when you mentioned that you were different from the people around you, and that your parents were going through intergenerational trauma, I mean, this is what comes to mind for me. How do you respond to that, and how does that look for you as an individual today, as you write about your history? I mean, that's a big topic, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jewish identity is an interesting thing, and there are many assimilated Jews now. But when uh, things go bad, it does not matter if you're assimilated, and certainly that was the case in the 30s. Um, Hitler identified those with mixed heritage as Mischling, and
Hmm.
they weren't allowed to get married or reproduce because they had some bad genes in them. So that again, so it doesn't really matter whether you and to be and the whole concept of identify a Jew. There's like two parts to it. One is the religious part, but there is a strong culture within the Jewish people. We're not. I I don't even say we're a race, but we have been apart from the rest of the communities many times in the past, often not by choice, and but sometimes it is by choice in order to um, protect and preserve the community. And so, where am I today? I'm not exactly what I would call religious, though. I do attend religious services on occasions, but I strongly identify as culturally as a Jew. And
So when you attend religious, is that at a synagogue?
yes,
No.
yes,
Well, so I lived in Germany for 10 years, and I visited Dachau a number of times. And I speak several languages. So I was, and back in the day, I was studying Russian. I could read it in all four languages. Ni vida, ne plus jamais, never again. And I've forgotten what exactly it says in Russian. It was in those four languages. Never again. That was the sentiment of the entire world as it realized that it had stood and looked into the abyss, and in some cases gone into the abyss, those who participated in the Holocaust. We'll see a video in a little bit about what happened in Hungary, and you mentioned Romania. It wasn't just Germany. And even in France, they went along with it, and even churches went along with it. The world looked into the abyss. They recoiled in horror. They said, never again. But in the studio, before we were coming out live, you mentioned that, you've seen all your life hints of those sentiments, but that it almost seems to have gotten a little bit worse in recent months and years.
Yeah, first thing, I was, maybe I'm a little cynical, but I never used the term "never again" because we have a 2,000-year history of hate.
Yeah.
So who's to say that it's not going to happen again? The term I use was always "never forget," and so that's part of my mandate. Is I talk about it because people are forgetting the lessons, forgetting what happened. But yeah, it's. Am I shocked by what's going on in the world right now? No, not in the least bit. I can tell you that there are a lot of shocked people Jewish people in North America because following the war, it was sort of a golden era for Jewish people in North America. There was anti-Semitism, but it was not overt. They thrived professionally and in the arts and in business. And there were very few barriers, as there were maybe several decades before. So when this outburst of anti-Semitism started a couple of years ago, most of the people were in shock. I spoke to a lot of people. I interviewed them for my book, and I always asked about their reaction. And most of them had told me they'd never experienced any anti-Semitism in their life, which I find odd because I guess I was not as lucky. But
well, I think there's a glass half full, glass half empty thing going on there. That as long as people, it's kind of like when they do the poll of consumer sentiment. What is consumer sentiment this holiday season, right? And if the glass is half full, people are out spending like drunken sailors, right? And if the sentiment is glass half empty, they may be more inclined to save. And I think in the glass half full kind of world, it's like, sure, whatever those little microaggressions, right? Those microaggressions, they're just overlooked, and they're, you know what I mean? And I think
that could be. But some of them grew up in in Jewish communities where they just weren't exposed.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in New York City, you live in Brooklyn. Well, yeah.
Well, I live in Brooklyn, but it's Brooklyn, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay, that's a little different. But yeah. So, but I took it as a reality that they really, maybe there were little instances, but certainly nothing that obviously upset them or sunk in. Not right. Like what's going on today, where you have, you have rallies in public places where anti-Semitism is like in full display, and the police look on.
I'm not shocked in a way, but I'm still flabbergasted, and I still find it unbelievable. Yeah. You know what I mean? But yeah. we're gonna go to a quick break, and when we come back, I want to go in the reverse direction, because you said never forget, but it's almost as though your parents kind of wanted to forget or at least not talk about it. So let's come back to that topic when we return from this commercial break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more from Willie Handler, child of Holocaust survivors.
Growing up, the shadows of the Holocaust loomed large. My parents' experiences, a constant reminder, finish your dinner. But they never told me the whole story. I had to uncover it myself. A journey into the past, revealing the extraordinary survival and painful losses of my family, and the secrets they took to their graves, forcing me to see them in a new light. I finally stepped out of the shadows. Read my story. A story of resilience, trauma, and the unbreakable bonds of family.
So Willie, yeah, your parents didn't want to talk about it. They were traumatized. It affected you. Unpack all that a little bit for us.
Well, they weren't exactly, they weren't the same. So my father was the most traumatized. He had a much worse experience. You don't spend 3 years in concentration camps without it affecting you. Where you see degradation and killings and starvation, disease on a daily basis. It's just it's almost unspeakable. But and so he said things from time to time, and if you asked him questions, he would attempt to answer, and then inevitably he would break down into tears. And as a child, you don't want to cause that kind of pain to a parent, so you stop asking. My mother was more open, but I would classify her as one of the worst storytellers you could ever meet. The stories got so, and they got so mixed up and confused. I really couldn't understand what happened to her. And
well, and how old was she when things were happening to her?
she was a teenager.
Yeah.
She was for example, when she was deported to Ukraine, she was 18 years old. So she wasn't a young child. But
but
she was
still, I mean, there are psychological defense mechanisms,
right. That's exactly what I was going to get to.
Right.
Is that it was clear to me that she blanked certain things out. I would ask a question, and she was just, I don't remember. There was a lot of I don't remembers. So, and you certainly don't want to push her to remember. So and so I didn't get full stories. I remember that my mother in 1995 did a Shoah Foundation interview, and the Shoah Foundation was started by Steven Spielberg after he did.
And for those who don't know in the audience, Shoah is I don't know what language that is, but it's the term
Hebrew.
for it's a Hebrew word for Holocaust.
Right, and so he funded a foundation to film. And for film survivors so they could tell their story. When my mother did one of those in 95, I didn't watch it until 3 years ago. And I garnered some additional information, but it was the same thing. The woman was interviewing her, and she would try and prod her to say more, and she just couldn't. And it was one of the shorter interviews because I've watched a number of them.
Yeah, I can relate not to the magnitude and the horror of it, but I think you may know I was in a domestic kidnapping as a child. My younger sister was also in that. We were taken to Sweden and we were
Right.
placed with relatives separated. My sister was 5. And by the time we came back 2.5 years later, she had completely forgotten English. And her Swedish, she was like a native Swede, for Swedish was her language. But then, within a few years, she had forgotten Swedish. And my experience was very different, I've thought about that a lot over the years. That's how she processed the trauma. It was very traumatic for her at that young age. And she just adapted and put out of her mind what actually happened because it was too traumatic to be ripped away from your mom when you're 4.5 years old and plopped in a country where you don't know anybody and you don't speak the language. And then you're brought back, into a completely different world. And then that fell apart because my mother was an alcoholic. So her experiences were very traumatic, and she managed to just forget everything, even the language that she spoke.
Yeah, and I maybe the most sort of shocking thing that I discovered about my father is when we were growing up, he would talk about his wife and his daughter, not 2, but 1 daughter. And all I heard was, she was 4 years old and they took her and he started to cry and so on and so forth. And
I
when
can't imagine it. We just had a situation tonight. We have a cat that's been an indoor cat. We let the cat outside in recent months, and suddenly there was this horrible squeal, and we thought an animal got the cat. And turns out that wasn't what happened. The cat was maybe chased the animal away, but for just a couple of minutes, we thought we lost the cat. And just the horror of that. I cannot imagine. I cannot fathom being the father of a 4-year-old daughter and having that happen. I can't.
Well, here's the interesting thing. So when I started memoir, I started doing a lot of research, and I needed to know who else in the family there was, because he didn't talk about family members who had passed away. And so I sent away to a Polish archive for marriage registration material and birth registrations for his daughter. And it all comes back, but there's birth registrations for 2 daughters. And
Wow.
like my father didn't. So that's what trauma does. He buried the memory of his younger child. And was the old one ever 4 years old? No, because he did not know when she died. He doesn't know that. He did not know. I'm positive he did not know the circumstances of her death, or the 2 girls' death. But I do, because I did enough research to know exactly when the selection took place in the ghetto, and when they were shipped away to Auschwitz, and they were
Because the Germans were excellent record keepers.
Then they went, and they were sent directly to the gas chambers, because a woman with 2 young kids is not going to survive. And so they perished at the ages of 11 months and 27 months. And here he is walking around saying, I lost my 4-year-old daughter. It's
Well, and he may have
heartbreaking.
he may have held out hope for a couple of years that she was still alive or something.
No,
Who knows how the 4-year-old number got
I
stuck?
don't. Oh, because that would have been her age at the end of the war,
Yeah.
had she survived.
So he didn't remember the actual events. He remembered a version that matched.
He wasn't there. So
Yeah.
he'd already been deported before they were sent away.
Got it.
And
and we'll go there in a minute when we go to the next commercial break about this other book. But today there's Holocaust deniers that are growing, and so to imagine not only that not only did that happen, but then to deny that it ever happened.
I, by coincidence, last week, because it's Holocaust Education Week in Toronto last week, and I did a program on the Holocaust denial, and it was, it was, it's sort of the topic was during the in the digital age, and how it's changed. And I was actually with a friend of mine who, early in her life, was a white supremacist. And so the two of us presented, and um, I remember the host at the end asking us, it's like you're swimming, you're swimming up current, and are you actually making any progress? And all I said is, if I can reach one person, if I can reach two people, I've made an impact. And that's kind of all the work that I do. It's reaching out and seeing how many people I can touch, and tell my story and make them understand what this world is really like, and and how hate will destroy us all, every single one of us.
Well, I just a couple of weeks ago saw an interview, one of our sister podcasts by another author in the something or other publishing universe, and she was interviewing, happened to be a Muslim, a formerly Muslim woman who had been born and raised in London, who was very, very much an anti-Semite. And she was describing what it was like and how that happened. And it had to do with, and I think, I forget which country, but I think she might have gone to Turkey. And there, Jew hatred was stronger, and yet it didn't really affect her. She felt at home. And, but then I forget, she came back, and then there was some situation where this Jewish person was being bullied by, a group of people. And it touched her humanity, and this person broke down and started crying because of the accusations were being hurled at this person just because they were a Jew, things that they had nothing to do with, and you know what I mean. So, but it touched her, and that's when she began realizing, and it ended up. So yes, reaching one person.
It's one person at a time.
But it feels like there's a tsunami coming, actually. So when you talk about swimming upstream and making progress, and suddenly there's a tsunami coming down the other way. And I think about, I was reflecting on the fact that certain Jewish hostages remains are being returned to Israel, and they just discovered the remains of somebody who had been killed years ago before the recent October 7th events. And what the family went through in terms of having the remains and a degree of closure in a way. And so the importance of making sure that even the remains are returned, all these things matter. So we're going to go to a quick commercial break. When we come back, I want to talk about not only your book about coming out of the shadows, but the book that you're working on intergenerational trauma and the resolution of that. But before I go, any comments before we go to a quick commercial break?
Oh, you were asking for comments from me. Oh, I'm sorry.
Are there any comments before we go?
And I'm cluing out. I'm waiting for the commercial to come on. Well, anti-Semitism seems to be, I should be shifting more and more into anti-Semitism because just because of it's the roots of, I've done a lot of thinking and reading about anti-Semitism, and it's not like other forms of hate. It's solely based on conspiracy theories. The Nazis knew the truth, but they spread all these conspiracy theories because it served their purpose. And they have existed for 2,000 years, the same ones over and over again, in particularly the blood libel. And they've come back. And so
in
this is why
different permutations, different, it's like a virus that mutates.
Yeah, and that's why I say never again. Of course, that's absurd. Because it's never gone away. Hate for Jews has never disappeared, never will. I don't even understand it, but it's there.
Yeah. Well, this commercial break is featuring a book by actually somebody I went to college with. He has unfortunately passed on. It was during the COVID pandemic, and it was after these are the facts, it was after he came to America and was vaccinated in order to come to America, that shortly after that he passed away. But he did original historical research on this book, which was published in 2012 by Something or Other Publishing. It's actually the first book published by Something or Other Publishing. And when the UN archives were unveiled in 2015, some of the facts were then corroborated around this. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more from Willie Handler. Welcome back to Creating the Image of God. I'm here with Willie Handler, the child of Holocaust survivors. And Willie, right before the break, we said we would talk a little bit about your first and second book. So maybe wrap up the discussion on that first book, Coming Out of the Shadows, and how you eventually came to write the book. And then we'll get into the one that you're now working on finishing up.
Okay. So very quickly, my pandemic project was to do a memoir. Well, I started off writing my family story, and then I sort of evolved into a memoir. And it was, again, it's not my first book, but all my other books were fiction novels. And I approached the book very much the same as my novels, but it was, of course, nothing like it because I had to sort of tap into my psyche. And as I started remembering things from my childhood, all this trauma I've been bearing and carrying around for decades just kind of flooded out. At some point, I was kind of overwhelmed, and that's when I had to start therapy so that I could finish that project and start the next one. And I did a tremendous amount of research because I knew very little. Certainly not enough to write a book. I remember when I first wrote down my parents' story, it was an 1,800-word blog post because that's all I really knew. And so the book starts out with a very brief history of my family. I found out where my mother's family came from, and my father's family. They've been in the same village for a couple hundred years. Um, and I couldn't go much farther back because there just weren't records that went back that far. And so, and I explained what happened to them during the war, and it sort of the in the sort of the background, I was describing other things that were going on during the war, so coincide with what was happening with them, and then um, I wrote about myself growing up, and the latter part of the book was sort of dedicated to topics that's kind of like sort of flowed from there. It was about anti-Semitism, intergenerational trauma, and uh, that was sort of that book. I basically used it to unpack all my trauma. After that, I I decided, I haven't. I People like me, children of descendants, even grandchildren, don't necessarily talk much about what they experience. And I was starting to get a little curious. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a little project. Maybe I'll write a book, and I'll interview a couple dozen people. And that grew to over 100. And what I people there were a lot of people who wanted to be interviewed, more than I needed. They wanted to tell their story and unpack their own trauma. And a couple of people told me they felt like they felt that the interview was like cathartic. And so it was some very, very powerful interviews, some of them pretty triggering as well. It's very difficult for me, and I basically just 2 weeks ago finished a first draft, and I think it's an incredible book. And I don't brag about my books. I'm pretty hard on myself, but this some of it will be groundbreaking. I have a whole section on descendants who were raised Christian and only later in their life as adults discovered that a parent was Jewish and was a Holocaust survivor, and then
Wow.
the whole world, their whole life started to make sense to them. And they also invariably, some of them had developed sort of an identity crisis. Um, and I have a section on just Israelis, because diaspora Jews and Israelis are very different. They're raised, one diaspora Jews are a minority everywhere they are, and so when it comes to Holocaust, it's in Israel. It's part of the culture. You learn about it in school. You celebrate it nationally. When you come to North America, as an example, you celebrate it within your family, uh, in your community, and that's kind of it. And the outside world doesn't really know much about it, if they even realize it at all. And so it it has a very different meaning to you, depending on where you live. So I did that separate section, and I compared second generation with third generation, and I talked about what happens to families, what impact it has the family unit. And I and there's some amazing stories in there. You were during the commercial. You part of it talked about the 12,000 some odd people who were drowned in the Danube. One of the people I interviewed, her mother and her grandmother were taken with a bunch of other Jewish people to the banks of the Danube, and they were all told to strip, and they started shooting them all. And partway through, they ran out of ammo, and they started reloading, and all those people waiting took off, ran away, and her mother and her grandmother survived. They just ran off naked. And I mean, I can't say it like she did, but it
No,
was
I
very
remember hearing,
powerful.
I know that particular story. I've heard that particular story. And there's another person, I believe, because I think it was a man that, if
Yeah.
the details are fuzzy, but I've heard that story before.
Yeah. And so maybe it might have been the same day.
Right.
But and so I heard stories of people nearly meeting their death and escaping, and it
Yeah.
was I ended up with thousands of pages of transcripts that I had to somehow
Well, and
stitch together, right? Stitch together into a book.
one of the things we were talking about right before this show was the fact that in the current climate, you're receiving rejection letters about this book. And even the previous book that you had published, there was an issue in the wake of what happened on October 7th a few years ago with its availability and its publication, which is what got us talking about the whole recent rise of anti-Semitism, and that there are certain narratives, right, that just aren't acceptable. And I want to sort of transition now and maybe bring in a couple of the audience comments. I want to go back to one that was very early, when you first said that history will repeat itself. Brandstat 25 said, you're spot on. History will repeat itself, and then added this comment, which was, I mean, with the school systems not teaching history. And this led me to want to share something. So I resigned from the ministry in 1995 to separate my faith from my paycheck. It's a long story, but I then ended up, because of being denied this job that I had basically in the bag, and I won't go into the circumstances of why that didn't happen, but I ended up then teaching fourth and fifth grade for a couple of years in a private school in California. And there was a state curriculum that we used. It was, the state of California said, this is the social studies book that will be taught. And in that social studies book for fourth grade, it was chapter after chapter after chapter of how white males oppressed every imaginable other identity. And it was therefore very lopsided. And I'm not denying that some of the things in the book happened and that they were also factually represented. But the overview, it was completely one-sided and very negative and derogatory towards white males. Some of it deserving. But the point of bringing it up here, and the thing that to me was unconscionable, was that the chapter on World War II focused on how in America we had concentration camps in which the Japanese were placed. Again, some factually accurate information and not necessarily a positive part of our history. But the moral equivalency that was created between having Japanese citizens interred while we were at war with Japan after Japan attacked us, for a period of time, whatever did or didn't happen in those camps, there was nothing close. They were not concentration camps. Concentration camps were a feature of the Holocaust. And again, I visited Dachau multiple times. And, they have archival records of the piles of clothing and the piles of shoes and, what the gas chambers were like and what the ovens were like. There's no moral equivalency. So to spend the time teaching fourth graders about World War II, and that's what they learn about World War II, this is what is meant by his comment. I mean, with the school systems not teaching history. Of course, they're teaching history, but are they really teaching a balanced view of history?
And There was a recent report by the government that stated that in Ontario, which is the province I'm in, the school system, there is now systemic anti-Semitism. And a lot of Jewish parents are pulling their kids out of the public school system because of it. But I mention that because it's mandatory in Ontario to teach the Holocaust. So we're having perhaps anti-Semitic teachers teaching the Holocaust. How's that going to work? And I'm not painting everybody's same brush,
Well,
but
and they
certainly
can,
some of them are. Some of them clearly must be.
yeah. I won't comment because I don't know the details, but obviously I
There was,
believe it first you.
there was one instance of a student in Ottawa who was one parent was Jewish, one was not, and supposedly a teacher told that child she was only half human.
Wow. So
This is 2025, not 1933.
well, and again, when I was teaching that, it was 1995. Those fourth graders are now parents,
Right.
and their children are getting an even
Worse.
more
It's even worse.
skewed version of events. Sorry, a large animal is attacking me here. This is Licorice. This is the cat that I was describing earlier that we thought.
Oh my God. That cat's is larger than I am.
Well, that's why we're now calling her officially the guard cat of our residence after what happened earlier tonight. So I don't know if everybody got to hear her meowing there. Come on, Licorice, it's okay. What's up? She must know we're talking about her. So this is a question. When did you start writing Out from the Shadows? God is Good is curious as to how long it took you to put the book together.
I began in late 20. I believe I began late 2020, maybe December or January of 2021. I would say when it took me about 2 years because I had to do a lot of research. And in fact, I went to Poland in August 2022 and to do some additional research. And it was when I got back that I officially really finished the first draft. So that would be like 2 full years essentially.
And was there kind of a catharsis or at least some epiphanies or revelations personally for you as you wrote that book?
No. I get that question asked a lot. No, it was it put me in therapy. So it was obviously not cathartic. And it was when the book was released, and it was almost a year ago today. It was November 9th of 2024. I released it on Kristallnacht, the anniversary. I remember that evening. That was the cathartic moment for me. And then it was kind of all behind me, and it was a relief. And it wasn't until that point where I was actually able to really start to enjoy it.
Yeah. So speaking of the new book, then, was it addicting once you started interviewing willing interviewees about this trauma? Because you mentioned there were a couple of dozen, and then it turned into, 100 or so.
No, they were difficult to do. I remember my wife was begging me to stop already, or slow down, but I wouldn't say it was addictive, but rather what I learned was the sample size was just too small. I needed to, and everybody's story was so different that I needed to have a much broader group, and it was early on I realized if I was physically able to do it, I would do about 100, and I wasn't sure whether or not I'd be able to make it, because it took quite an emotional toll, and I had some there were some pretty bad days during that thing. So no, it was not the least bit addictive. It's a relief to be over them.
Well, this is kind of reverse then. Did you ever have anyone walk out of an interview super duper could picture that happening more than once?
No, what did happen was that there was there was one person who sort of had regrets, and he his rationale was he thought he was going to be speaking to a therapist. Well, that's interesting because I I I told everybody going in, I'm not I'm not a clinician. I'm a writer, and so I'm doing research for a book. And anyways, he was like all upset and basically pulled out. And I said, no problem. I said I deleted his the video of his interview and the transcripts, and certainly and right now, in fact, I'm going about sending out people who landed in the book, their portion, and getting them to sign a release,
Yep.
because and
Yes.
so nothing's going forward without those who are involved. They're okay.
Yeah. So if you and we'll have to talk, right? Because something or other publishing might possibly be an option for the release of that book if you're having challenges, finding the right publisher. But what do you anticipate are the next steps and the timeline of the release of that book?
Um, well, a lot of it depends on when a publisher is found, but we're early in the process,
Mhm.
and now have a full manuscript
Right.
in, instead of a book proposal, but I'm going to even update that, because I realize now it reflected my mindset probably about 8-10 months ago,
Yeah.
and the book looks kind of different because it just kept evolving in my head.
Right.
And so I'm getting everyone's consent right now. It probably will take me, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks to round that up. I will do a round of editing based on the feedback I get. Uh, I, I got some things wrong,
Yeah.
or people were, some people were they were pretty emotional, nervous, and didn't themselves get it right. And so there'll be that, and then I wait. Literally, I wait until we land the publisher. I have an agent who is, and her agency is very committed to this book. They think it's a very important book. They just have to convince a publisher
Right.
that it is a very important book. I personally have been working on uh, my own personal platform to ensure the book's success, and been trying to convince show publishers who are checking me out that I do have this platform. And so I'm doing something like this,
Right.
and I've probably done close to 30 podcast interviews in the last year. That's basically almost one a week.
Well, we're very
Once,
grateful to you for doing this one here. We're out of time. I have to now invite you to share, your sort of last thoughts, parting words, closing comments with the audience tonight.
so one of the things I and there are one of the things I wanted to make clear to people, and I have to make this clear to editors as well, that I chose descendants of Holocaust survivors because it's a community I'm very familiar with, and I knew that they would open up to me because I'm one of them, which was very important. Otherwise, the book's not going to be very good. But everything, what I talk about in the book, what I've observed, applies universally. So, if your grandfather was a soldier in World War II, he came back traumatized by his experience, or your mother was subject to child abuse, and on and on. There's so many sources of trauma. All this stuff applies. The impacts are the same, and the resolution and how to deal with your trauma and how to break that cycle applies. And so, what I'm preaching is not just to one community, but to the broader community. And I think that's important for people to understand. So, when people pick up the book, that it's not a book about the Holocaust. It's a book about trauma and how to break the cycle where trauma gets passed on from one generation to another.
Well, Willie, it's been just a pleasure, and I've learned a lot. So does Hugh Knows, who says we need to have you back, and Andrew Harrington, we need to hear more from our elders like this. This is what is lost in a lot of society today. So obviously connecting with some of the audience members here as well. Thank you to those of you who are, putting comments in the chat. I hope you will check out Willie's book. I'm sure it's available wherever books are sold and on Amazon, etc. The first book, which is Out from the Shadows with Willie Handler. And then, of course, stay tuned. We may very well be inviting you back, Willie, as you draw closer to getting that book published, and maybe with a big book launch. So
right.
Thank you so much for being here. I have
You're
but one
welcome.
task left to do, and that is to show the sneak peek of next week's episode. But meanwhile, let me remind the audience of our tagline. We're creating the image of God, building vibrant communities. That's our purpose. But we like to always remind you that you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you all next week. Here's what you can expect. Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson back with a sneak peek for the upcoming episode on November 18th of Created in the Image of God. I am in the studio with a foreign guest from another land far away. Yiska Smith is dialing in from Israel. She has an amazing journey. She has a book that was published in June called Planting Seeds of the Divine Torah Commentaries to Cultivate Your Spiritual Practice. But Yiska grew up with parents in America who were in the process of being assimilated. And it wasn't until her visit to Israel between her sophomore and junior year that the land literally and figuratively spoke to her, and she knew she had to go back. Welcome to the studio, Yiska.
Thank you. Thank you, Wade.
So we've just been having an extended conversation. We couldn't really get this sneak peek going because your life is so fascinating and so intriguing. So the title of the show is Spiritual Awakening, Reclaiming Your Divine Identity. Tell us about that moment when you set foot in Israel in 1971 and the land spoke to you.
So I was in Jerusalem, visiting Jerusalem as tourists do, without a strong Jewish identity, surely not a Zionist, traditional Zionist identity. I came to Israel, I thought, to volunteer and work on a kibbutz to experience the communal lifestyle. And there I am at the Western Wall, as we all, as tourists, do approach. And I looked left, I looked right, everyone's putting their head against the stones and they're crying or they're smiling, they're praying. So I put my head against the wall and I hear this voice move through me, welcome home. And at first it startled me. It really, I had no context within which to understand that. And then I reflected on it and I felt, I really like being here. Like I really I feel like I'm home. Like there's a pull. And I didn't know what that was. And I knew I had to investigate and research and contemplate on this idea of welcome home. That's how it started.
And we talked then subsequently, you came back in 1973. And at that time, you know, you within a month you experienced the Yom Kippur War, which was troubling, and yet that is the moment when you decided to return. But what we also talked about is that the Western Wall where you prayed has actually been extended by the religion of ministry to accommodate a common space for men and women to pray together. So Israel is evolving. Tell us a little bit about that and your status as a thought leader in Israel.
As a thought leader, I cultivate creative thinking, creative and respectable pushback on status quo in order to evolve and in order to be more of activate our potential. So in 1971, the Ministry of Religion, after the Six-Day War in 1967, they defined the religious observance as in the Orthodox tradition, which means there's a divider, and men are on one side and women are on another. And from 1967 through about 10 years ago, I'd say I don't know the exact date. I think it was about 10 years ago, 2015. The Ministry of Religion with the Knesset, it had to go through the governmental approval, assigned another section of the Western Wall because of where we are today, where there's a concern and there's an interest for more of a egalitarian engagement in our ritual prayer community services. They opened up a section, and it's called the egalitarian. Actually, it's called the Israelite section for anyone, regardless, male, female, and I guess today even more people who identify in different ways with gender. But there's no separation between the men and the women there. It's equally holy, it's equally a place of sanctity, and it's equally a place that affords just other groups of people to feel included in the bigger whole of the nation of Israel and in the nation of humanity.
Well, thank you. We're going to get into this in a deep way on November 18th. I'll share that when I was there in 81 and I visited Elijah's cave, there was a sign outside on Mount Carmel about Eretz Israel and the Holy Land. I was back more recently and don't see that same sign in the same way, but this idea of evolving, I almost feel like in a way I'm coming home here in this conversation with you to understand how we build vibrant communities, which is the tagline of this show, created in the image of God, building vibrant communities. So this is going to be a special episode, an important episode. I really want to encourage everyone listening to this sneak peek to show up at 8 p.m. Central Time on November 18th with Yiska Smith and Spiritual Awakening, Reclaiming Your Divine Identity. We'll see you there.